Pay close attention. What you're about to see is Bible prophecy being fulfilled.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you the news that relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yeshua Hawkins. Well, in the news tonight, we have the latest on the coronavirus, now hitting a certain age group specifically hard. We'll have those details. Also, some of the current statistics with the coronavirus, how globally and nationally, what the numbers look like, and is it starting to subside, or is the spread continuing? Also, we have Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Deborah Birx, two of the leading experts on coronavirus and the studies. Right. And we'll have some of their comments on what is being done and the curve and so forth, all the latest details. But first, our first story takes us to China, where they have watched too many scenarios of the U.S. weaponizing the U.S. dollar in an attempt to control other countries. Now, China is aware they could be next to be sanctioned and are not waiting until the U.S. makes their move. They're simply tired of, quote, U.S. threats to interfere, unquote, and are making plans to fight back with their own global currency.
Well, it is no secret that China has for a long time been considering if they would join Russia in their efforts to stop the U.S. from having total control over the world's trade and transfer of products. Well, China believes the U.S. plans to cut them off from the global financial banking system, and they are not going to take that lying down.
Well, some might be asking, why take action now? Well, Chinese experts and officials both agree until now they have never seen the U.S. weaponize the U.S. dollar like Trump's administration has and continues to threaten countries with it.
China making such a drastic move would certainly put a strain on the entire global market like never before seen. But China does not see other options for survival. A top Chinese economic official has been quoted as saying China needs to make some, quote, real preparations, not just psychological preparations.
Well, he, as well as others, believe that it is only a matter of time before President Trump's White House will do them as previous administrations have done to Russia, sanctioning them until they have no abilities to buy or sell in the global market. Now, their fear is that not only would they be prohibited from trading products, but currency exchange would also not be allowed, thus making the country of China totally destabilized.
Well, that is why they call it weaponizing the U.S. dollar. They insist countries only trade with the U.S. dollar. So it's like they are making an economic nuclear strike, figuratively speaking, of course, and the repercussions economically would not only affect China, but would ripple out to the entire world when China retaliates with their own economic plan.
Well, so now we have to wonder, how serious is the U.S. about turning its threats into reality, and how serious is China about striking back? Well, could they rally the global market against using the U.S. dollar?
Well, co-host of RT's Boom Bust weighed in on this matter in a live broadcast with RT's Rick Sanchez, as she explained China is, quote, taking a defensive stance right now to prepare for the possibility of being cut off from the U.S. dollar payment system in case the U.S. sanctions Chinese companies and banks.
Well, according to Christy I, China perceives this threat as real and knows it is vulnerable if it does not take steps to protect itself, because she said, quote, the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency and all trade is conducted in it. So as such, China mainly relies on the U.S. dollar payment systems in most of its international dealings.
Well, as we've reported in the past, China has done some test runs on trading with Russia and India last year using their own native currencies. Christy I says, and while those test runs were quite successful, it was still on a very small scale. So China is quickly realizing this is a very big vulnerability if things take a nasty turn.
So what China is working on now is being less dependent on the U.S. dollar, but the U.S. could view this as a reason to cut China out of the financial market. Now that would mean denying China access to the SWIFT network like they did to Iran. But Christy I explains that would have severe blowbacks on the global economy because cutting China off from SWIFT would be economic suicide. Now, the U.S. currently runs about $350 billion in annual trade deficit with Beijing, and the PPOC holds over $1 trillion in U.S. debt. So, the U.S. really can't do without trade with China, and China can't do without trade with the U.S.
Well, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres addressed the Security Council and expressed Israel's proposed annexation of the West Bank as a violation of international law, grievously harms the prospect of a two-state solution, and he called on Israeli government to abandon its annexation plans. Well, the Palestinian foreign minister chimed in regards to Israel's attitude in this matter, and he said Israel thinks or has experienced so far that it will not be fined or arrested, and that Security Council resolutions are binding for others. International courts and sanctions are binding for others.
Well, since Israel's occupation of the contested land since the 1967 Israeli war, this is the first time that Israel is planning to declare sovereignty over the territory. Now, the U.S.'s stance on the moves by Israel is that those decisions are for the Israelis to make, according to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo.
Yeah, so if anybody's looking for any help or assistance from the United States, since the U.S. is a strong ally of Israel, apparently they're not going to get that.
Doesn't sound like it.
That's right. Well, as we move forward a little bit in regards to something that's been in the news quite often and pretty much prominent, the coronavirus, and we're seeing a surge in this, but a new demographic, or not really a new demographic, but one that was thought to be kind of pretty immune to it. Research is showing that they're actually becoming one of the larger groups of those coming down with COVID-19. Larry McGee, our correspondent, has more information for us on that matter. Larry, what do you have?
Where the issue of morality is concerned, genetics have always offered sobering evidence of who we are and are not, especially as is reflected in the moral qualities and character traits passed on to one's offspring. The unruliness and disobedience of many youth today has its root in the disobedience of the parents who were just as rebellious in their day, the end result of which is a present generation that is disinclined to accept advice or pursue much of anything outside of their feelings, and that in and of itself creates serious problems. But those problems become magnified during critical times when following instructions means the difference between managing an unprecedented pandemic or exacerbating it. The worst plague to strike humanity so far is striking younger people in greater numbers, according to recent statistics. By young, we're speaking of citizens younger than 50 and largely in key states such as Texas. Analysts say that the demographic could have played a significant role in passing on the affliction from the outset, but might have been overlooked due to a heavier focus on older citizens who were succumbing to the malady in large numbers owing to what are now being tactfully and cosmetically referred to as comorbidities. The catchphrase is a softer term for co-infections. Now, however, with infection rates among the older population appearing to stabilize, all of the attention is shifting to the younger population, who in most cases are no less infected, but not as immunocompromised and emboldened by their youth and lack of symptoms and health complications. The concern, however, is that as they spread the plague en masse while playing and fraternizing in bars and other social scenes, it might produce a resurgence among the vulnerable sectors of the population. For YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. Katan Jeff, back to you.
Well, the warning was put out pretty early that that age group would have to be mindful because they do have that kind of invincible type attitude, and now we see that statistics are actually showing they should have taken it seriously.
That's right. That's right.
Well, to continue on with more facts here, are more of the statistics regarding the COVID-19, 25 states are experiencing a big jump in the number of coronavirus cases. 1 in 5 new infections globally are in the U.S., with Texas and Florida setting new records for positive tests, causing the governors in those states to crack down on social distancing measures. Now, more than 120,000 people in the U.S. have been killed by the COVID-19 and more than 2.3 million cases nationally. Now, the White House says that those numbers are up because of stepped-up testing and not reopening measures. Well, the White House also defended the president's decision to slow down testing to keep the numbers of infections from looking too large.
Well, California, Texas, and Florida all broke their own records for the largest single-day increase in positive coronavirus cases, with California having over 7.1 thousand cases and Texas and Florida coming in at 5.5 thousand cases in, like we said, just one day. Well, the CDC predicts 30,000 more Americans could die by mid-June. And as a total here in the United States, in just 24 hours, there were over 34,000 cases and 754 deaths of COVID-19.
Well, take a look at this next video from Dr. Deborah Birx and Dr. Anthony Fauci regarding where we are compared to 4 months ago in regards to this COVID-19, the testing, and measures taken. Take a look at this.
Just to remind everybody where we have come from in the last 4 months. Just to remind everybody where we have come from in the last 4 months. Just to remind everybody where we have come from in the last 4 months. We have a great deal of understanding now about the differential disease. Differential infections, no. We believe everybody is susceptible to infection. But we know infection leads to a spectrum of disease, and we have much better details about who is vulnerable and why they are vulnerable. And as the Vice President said, at one time, we were diagnosing people in the ICU after they came into the emergency room. And thanks to the millennials who have been heeding our guidance, they have been coming forward and getting testing. And so whereas before we told them to stay home, now we are telling them to be tested. And this is a great change for us because it allows us now to find the asymptomatic and the mild diseases that we couldn't find before. As Dr. Redfield talked about yesterday, from the serology test, we have a great understanding of what was happening in March and the number of asymptomatic and mild conditions that led to individuals to have antibody but never come forward with significant disease. We now know who's at risk for significant disease, and we now know it's particularly the elderly, individuals over 80, and individuals with comorbidities. And remember, those comorbidities span the entire age group. We do know that we have people in the younger age groups with significant type 1 diabetes, and may also have individuals with significant obesity. We know that those are risk factors, and so risk factors go with your comorbidity, not necessarily with your age. And so as we call on individuals to protect one another, by passing someone on the street, you don't know what comorbidities they have. And this is why we've been focused on trying to protect one another. So this really puts on one slide the states that we have that we've been talking about across the South where we have our greatest concerns. The two top states with the largest increase in test positives are Texas and Arizona, followed by Florida, Mississippi, South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Nevada, and Utah. Those last few states are under still 10%, but we're tracking them closely as we look at that individually. I know many of you would be interested in seeing how high the test positivity rate became in April and March and April. So that top line is New York City Metro, and you can see it reached over 50% on a series of days for almost 2 weeks. 50% of the tests were positive for COVID-19. Underneath that, you see New Jersey and Minnesota and a whole series of individuals. Detroit is the second large mountain. Next slide. So quickly to show you how we look at this at the state level and work with the governors and the local health authorities. So this is Florida. We track testing. It's done, the number of test positives that are in the blue line, the total number of cases seen in the black bar, and what we call the syndromic presentations of early respiratory diseases and pneumonias. Next slide. This then, we look at the county level to look for changes in the slope of the number of new cases. So you can see that top county that has the largest increase in slope in cases is Miami, Miami-Dade, followed by Broward and Palm Beach. All the other counties are much lower in their daily case increases. This allows us to focus resources and testing along with the state into these specific sites. Next slide. That all comes together to create this graphic so that individuals can understand and we can understand precisely what the rate of growth is and where the rate of growth is occurring by the shading of the boxes. Now I'm going to quickly take you through Texas because it's the same story. Next slide. So this shows you the exact same graphics now shown for Texas, showing a continued rise in the daily tests performed, but also a rise in the test positivity, the blue line. You can see throughout May, after opening, their test positivity continued to decline as their testing increased. It was in the last 2.5 weeks that we saw this inflection of rising test positivity along with rising testing. But it was the increase in test positivity that alerted us, along with the increased cases, that this was becoming an alert. You can see in the red boxes, everything is heat mapped. So at a glance, you can tell those two boxes that are in the middle that are red. That's the heat map showing that this has rising cases and rising test positivity. Next slide. But even in Texas, next slide, please. And this gives you a map of Texas that shows where the cases are and where they're rising the most rapidly. So this is California. And so you can see California over the last week has had that increase in test positivity. You can see that dramatic increase at the end of that bar in the blue line, along with still increasing testing that has been done. And we just want to thank all of the governors and all of the work at all the laboratories that has allowed us, along with HHS and Brett Gerard, who ensured that the supplies were there to really increase these orange lines. You could see in each of these cases, these orange lines have dramatically gone up over the last 4 weeks. Next slide. And like New Mexico, the primary infections right now in California at the highest level are in the LA area. But because LA is a large metropolitan area, next slide, you really need this kind of more specific and local graphic to really show that it's also increasing in the Central Valley. And this gives us the ability to focus resources among agricultural workers to improve testing and isolation for those who become positive.
Thank you very much, Dr. Birx, and thank you, Mr. Vice President. So I want to extend just for a couple of minutes some of the comments that were made both by the Vice President and by Dr. Birx, and it has to do with the situation that we find ourselves facing right now. It's very clear from the maps that you saw that there are certain areas in the country, states, towns, cities, regions, that are doing very well, that have followed the guidelines and are opening up in a prudent way that's been effective. However, as you can see, we are facing a serious problem in certain areas. Now, when you look at the map, it's very interesting because you see some dark parts of the map and some light parts of the map. We have a very heterogeneous country, but heterogeneity does not mean that we are not intimately interconnected with each other. So what goes on in one area of the country ultimately could have an effect on the other areas of the country. So let's take a look at this problem that we're facing now, this resurgence of cases. I don't think there's time enough now all day to try and analyze and figure out the multifaceted elements that went into that. You know, everything from maybe opening a little bit too early on some to opening at the right time, but not actually following the steps in an orderly fashion, to actually trying to follow the steps in an orderly fashion, but the citizenry did not feel that they wanted to do that for a number of reasons, likely because everyone feels the common feeling of being pent up for such a long period of time. So we're not going to say blame, we're not going to try and analyze it, but there is something that's very important about it that I'd like to get a message to the country in general. When you have an outbreak of an infectious disease, it's a dynamic process that is global. So remember, what happened in China affected us. What happened in Europe affected us. what's happening here is affecting others. We can't get away from that. It's interconnected. So therefore, if we are an interconnected society, we've got to look at the fact of what our role is in trying to put an end to this. Because everybody wants to end it, everybody wants to get back to normal, and everybody wants the economy to recover. I think we all are pretty common in that. That's a given. So what can we do? What I think, upon talking to a lot of people and reflecting on it, we have such an unusual situation because of all of the decades that I've been involved in chasing infectious diseases. I've never seen anything that is so protean in its ability to make people sick or not. There's no other infectious disease that goes from 40% of the people having no symptoms to some having mild symptoms, to some having severe, some requiring staying at home for weeks, some going to the hospital, some getting intensive care, some getting intubated, some getting ventilated, and some dying. So that depending on where you are in that spectrum, you have a different attitude to this particular thing. But anyone who gets infected or is at risk of getting infected, to a greater or less degree, is part of the dynamic process of the outbreak. And I know, because I can understand, when I was at a stage in my life when I said, well, I'm invulnerable, so I'm going to take a risk. I think what we're missing in this is something that we've never faced before, is that a risk for you is not just isolated to you. Because if you get infected, you are part, innocently or inadvertently, of propagating the dynamic process of a pandemic. Because the chances are that if you get infected, that you're going to infect someone else. And although you may feel well, and because we know, if you look at the numbers that you'll probably hear later on, the overwhelming majority now of people getting infected are young people, likely the people that you see in the clips and in the paper who are out in crowds enjoying themselves, understandably. No blame there, understandably. But the thing that you really need to realize, that when you do that, you are part of a process. So if you get infected, you will infect someone else who clearly will infect someone else. We know that happens because the reproduction element of the virus is not less than one. So people are infecting other people. And then ultimately you will infect someone who's vulnerable. Now that may be somebody's grandmother, grandfather, uncle who's on chemotherapy, aunt who's on radiation or chemotherapy, or a child who has leukemia. So there is what I call, and again, I just want to bring this out without making it seem that anybody's at fault. You have an individual responsibility to yourself, but you have a societal responsibility. Because if we want to end this outbreak, really end it, and then hopefully when a vaccine comes and puts the nail in the coffin, we've got to realize that we are part of the process. So when the vice president went back, pulling back a couple of months ago, when we showed about the guidelines to safely reopen the country, we've got to make sure we drop back a few yards and think about that this is part of a process, that we can be either part of the solution or part of the problem. We can be either part of the solution or part of the problem. We can be either part of the solution or part of the problem. So I just want to make a plea with people when they understand the stress that they're under, as we try to tackle not only those states, but the light-colored part of the country. Even though they've done well, they may have gotten hit badly like New York and then came down, or they may not have got hit badly at all. They are vulnerable. If we don't extinguish the outbreak, sooner or later, even ones that are doing well are going to be vulnerable to the spread. So we need to take that into account, because we are all in it together, and the only way we're going to end it is by ending it together. We can be either part of the solution or part of the problem. We can be either part of the solution or part of the problem.
Well, definitely steps are being taken. They're starting to see improvements in certain areas, but we're also seeing a surge in other areas, but it's not, every place is different on where they started to get these cases, and so we're seeing the numbers kind of fluctuate as the months move forward. But one thing is for sure is that nobody's invincible to COVID-19, and if proper measures aren't taken to protect themselves, which the government has implemented, and with social distancing and using the mask and so forth, those numbers are just going to increase.
Right, and as you mentioned, the masks and actually wearing gloves, two things that some of the governors now are making or wanting to make as a requirement that everybody wear a mask just to help slow the spread, especially if they're going to keep certain businesses open, like like some of the food establishments or the bars and so forth. I know that has been a real big topic lately as to whether or not that should even be open. So they're pushing wearing of the mask, and that is one thing that our viewers, if they're watching, that they can do to protect themselves.
That's right. Well, if you'd like to know more about what you can do to protect yourselves from the next 6 plagues that the House of Yahweh has been talking about that are upcoming very soon here, contact the House of Yahweh to find out more information. And when you do, don't forget to request your free copy of the monthly newsletter and the Prophetic Word magazine. Here's how.
Well, to contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at the House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494. You can visit any of their websites by going to Yahweh.com or YisraelHawkins.com. Also, you can go to Yahweh'sBranch.com. If you'd like to visit our website, you can do so by going to YPNnews.com. If you would like to email the House of Yahweh, you can do so by emailing info@Yahweh.com. For any international calls, please call the number that's on your screen. And once again, don't forget the Yisrael Says program by going to YisraelSays.com, or the Ask Yisrael program by going to AskYisrael.com. And if we've already mentioned, there's a tutorial there. It helps explain how to use the program. It'll take you through step by step. If you have any questions, that should answer them for you.
Well, don't go anywhere. Get your Holy Scriptures, a pencil, and something to write on, some paper, because up next is Yisrael Hawkins. From all of us here at YPN News, I'm Katan Alexander.
And I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
Thank you for watching.